Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome from home. I'm so glad to see you all at home, live from the auditorium of Tilburg University. Today we will have Flow's annual symposium. This year's symposium will be a bit different due to the corona measures, but I'm still glad to have you all joining us live from home. Today we will talk about conspiracy theories and filter bubbles. We have 4 speakers with us today who are going to tell us more about this. Our first speaker and also our keynote speaker is Dr. Pia Vares. Dr. Pia Vares is a professor from Online Culture Department of Tilburg University. She has done research to memes as a conspiracy theory category, and she will lead the rest of the symposium. During this symposium, you can ask any questions in the live stream in the comments section. Feel free to ask our speakers any questions at all, and I'm looking forward to it. I hope you have a great time, and I look forward to your questions. But first, Dr. Pia Vares.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you to the organizers for having me and us here. Promises to be a very exciting program. So what I'm going to do now is, for about 20 minutes, talk about conspiracy theories and filter bubbles, more about conspiracy theories than filter bubbles, but they are also inevitably related, as we will discover, or as you may already know, and then draw some conclusions about what to do about this, what kinds of implications does this have for research and understanding conspiracy theories and filter bubbles. So let me start by a very broad definition. There's, of course, a little bit of disagreement as to how to define conspiracy theories, and different fields like psychology, political science would have a different view somewhat on what conspiracy theories are. In a broad sense, they can be defined as intellectual constructs, modes of thinking, to give the appearance of order to events, so to give meaning to things that take place in the world. And what is crucial is that there is some kind of a group that is identified that through some kind of special means or powers or manipulations is trying to influence the world or the state of affairs. And in this equation, of course, conspiracy theorists are the people who make a claim to special kind of knowledge. They know something that other people don't know. They know the truth. They have access to it. So conspiracy theories are also very much a question of identity. In this respect, conspiracy theorists become a kind of a self-identified elite versus the herd or the sheep who, for some reason, are unable or unwilling to see the actual truth about the world. So that's the them, the others who are not into the conspiracy theory and all its workings. And then, as to why we should be talking about conspiracy theories, I think, well, just observing media nowadays give you some indication of their relevance, but this quote from Byford summarizes it very clearly, I would say. Conspiracy theories have migrated, increasingly we could perhaps say, from the margins of society to the center ground of politics and public life, and they are kind of an ever-present feature in contemporary political and popular culture nowadays. So that in itself makes it relevant. And here just very briefly to say something about a very prominent conspiracy theory that I'm sure many of you have heard about, QAnon, which is kind of an interesting case because we have been able to observe its development and basically implosion recently. Well, it's still very much alive, but not as alive, I guess you could say, as it was even 6 months ago. So it's a very complicated conspiracy theory, right? It has all kinds of branches and ideas attached to it. One central feature of QAnon is the idea that there is some kind of an elite group of people, often, as in the case of the US, it's the people from the Democratic Party who are involved in child sex trafficking. And recently in the media you have seen, with the US elections, you saw that adherents to the theory would, for instance, do all kinds of actions to try to disrupt the election so that their favorite, Donald Trump, would securely win. There have been stories emerging of people trying to come out of QAnon, and cult experts weighing in to say that it has cult-like features and it's very difficult to leave. So here you see stories like, my mom believes in QAnon and I've been trying to get her out. Or QAnon conspiracy theories are driving families apart because people have the idea that they live in completely different realities. And in the past 3 months, indeed, there has been a bit of a struggle by those who support and try to develop this conspiracy theory, namely because of the idea that Donald Trump was supposed to have won the election and is considered to be the legitimate president in the United States, according to the theorists. So one of their central slogans, of course, is trust the plan. So now the question is, why is not anything going according to plan? How is Joe Biden president? So that's just a short glimpse into something that is a very powerful and influential conspiracy nowadays, apparently has also been identified to have branches and supporters in Europe, so it's not only an American thing. So in that respect, it's also an interesting example because it's very much an international thing already. Well, not much more about QAnon. There's so many other stuff to talk about, but it's just a very interesting recent example of the relevance and shape of conspiracy theories. And just to say a little bit more about how do we understand conspiracy theories, what is their role in people's lives? Again, you have different perspectives on this, but one perspective that I find useful is to think about this in terms of ethno sociology, which for me as a cultural studies person makes a lot of sense. So what that means is that, so ethno-sociology in general has to do with the kinds of theories that ordinary people, that all of us have, that we use to explain social phenomena. So why are things the way they are in the world? So to give examples, why the divorce rate is so high, why kids drop out of school, why the rich are rich and the poor are poor, etc. So why is the world the way it is? And conspiracy theories have been defined as a type of ethno-sociology, namely that people use them to explain social misfortunes, so adversities they have in life, or misfortunes that other people may have, by attributing them to the deliberate and often secretly planned actions of a particular group of people. This is really central to the idea of conspiracy theory. And history in this understanding then, so how do events unfold, becomes the undisturbed realization of intentions. And the online dimension being my main focus, here is an example of what that undisturbed realization of intentions might mean in practice. This is a tweet by somebody who was running for Congress in the United States, and you see the point here is that she finds it very interesting how the show Masked Singer, so maybe you know this is, it's a kind of reality TV show where celebrities wear a costume so that they're not recognizable, and then they sing and people try to recognize who the singer is. And the person here is saying that it's very interesting how this show hit America in January 2019, a little bit over a year before they started forcing us all into masks. It's almost like they were beginning to condition the public that masks were normal and cool. So here you see, of course, I mean, sometimes you even wonder, is this irony or really something to be taken seriously? But this is really what the undisturbed realization of intentions means. It's not coincidental, it's not an accident. A Masked Singer became a popular TV program where people mask themselves. It really is about conditioning the public to be willing to wear masks because of the pandemic. And then, to move on to the online dimension a little bit more, why should we bother about conspiracy theories online and what we should make of them? Which is really the thing that I've been looking at most. So there is the rather more negative characterization by Fenster that the internet and the web are a petri dish for paranoids. So it's an ideal environment for paranoid people who think somebody might be after them. to come together and work together on conspiracy theories and develop them and to find like-minded people. Now, a somewhat less disparaging description, you could say, is that online spaces definitely have been identified as having a role in how conspiracy theories develop and spread. And here the idea is that they have a role in mainstreaming the fringe, so to speak. I will say a little bit more about that in just a second. And then, of course, there is the dimension, so you could say that it's a co-production between humans and machines. There is the algorithmic dimension, about which we will hear more later, I believe. But conspiracy theories have been identified as the kind of content, in this case, having to do with school shootings, and the kind of content that promotes conspiracy theories. So a couple of times already, YouTube, for instance, has been criticized because it promotes in top search results conspiracy theories, such as this one, where one of the school shootings that took place in the United States was apparently just staged. It didn't happen at all, and the people who were seen in the media as victims of the school shooting were described as actors. So basically, they're just faking it. And YouTube has been under fire for promoting this kind of content. Now, of course, here you get to the questions of what is the role of the human and what is the role of the environment here. And also for the purposes of discussion, because this is something I think we will return to, there are a couple of things that I think you can say. So first of all, the idea of orders of visibility, which refers to the idea that certain types of knowledge and information, this has always been the case, right? Certain types of knowledge and information are more visible than others. That's always been the case. And the claim has been made that online spaces, social media primarily, contribute to orders of visibility in the sense that certain types of knowledge and information that wouldn't have been so visible otherwise become more visible. This is really the mainstreaming the fringe idea. And then the question is whether they also become more credible because they get more visibility. And this is something that political scientists have, for instance, written about with the idea that there is the claim nowadays that people make. They say, I've seen a lot of people say something, so there must be something to it. Typical social media phenomenon. So yeah, it's of course debatable what exact effects there are, but certainly it is the case that there has been some kind of a shift in the kinds of things that are visible to us nowadays. Just consider how much more difficult it was to spread a conspiracy theory with a fax machine, right? Takes a little bit more time and effort to do that. Or the fact that online environments are so popular and so much used nowadays, right? They are such an integral part of people's lives that they must have some impact on how people engage with things. And secondly, of course, if we go to this point of new types of relationships and access to content, in the pre-online times, if you lived alone in a village and you had an interesting conspiracy theory, well, maybe it was more difficult for you in your small village to get people to support your idea or to find like-minded people. Nowadays, it's much easier to just go online and find like-minded people, right? I think these are undeniable facts. But then there is also the supply and demand question here. So again, maybe this is a point for a discussion, but you see a lot of debate amongst academics and also in the media regarding who is to blame, right? That it's YouTube promoting the conspiracy theories, they are more visible, and they are to blame for the state of affairs. I would say, however, that there is supply, so a lot of this stuff is more visible than before, but there must also be some kind of demand for it, right? That it's also something that people are interested in reading and interested in finding out about. So there are certain sociological dimensions to the popularity of conspiracy theories as well. And related to that, there is the idea of context design, right? So how is it that people come across and engage with conspiracy theories online? I think the idea of context design is very useful here, namely the idea that people design their environment, at least to an extent, themselves. So you choose whether you want to join an anti-vaccination group on Facebook. You choose if you want to become part of a group that focuses on lizard people conspiracy theories. You know, it's also a question of demand. So that's context design, that there is the human element, of course, to it, that we also design our media diets ourselves. And then if we talk about conspiracy theories online, I think it's useful to also remember that the online environments enable new kinds of communication, such as the use of memes, which is something that I've been looking into a little bit, and memes as a conspiracy genre. So now I don't have too much time left anymore, but there's just a point that I want to make about this kind of communication and how this might be relevant for understanding conspiracy theories and filter bubbles. So of course, when you mention the word meme, you think of something humorous, something funny. Yes, that's absolutely it. That's what memes are typically about, but not necessarily so. And even if they're humorous, they can also be something else at the same time. So here you see like a typical, more traditional kind of meme, or traditional in the sense of what people might associate with the idea of meme. So the idea is to be humorous. On the right, you see something that is circulated, and the kind of content that you would see circulated in different kinds of white supremacist and neo-Nazi circles, where you see the phrase 14 words, and I don't remember exactly word by word, because I don't find it a very engaging idea. I don't remember exactly what the 14 words are, but it's basically about the future of white children and how it must be ensured. The kind of slogan that white supremacists would use, and they would also be able to recognize each other with this, just by mentioning that catchphrase, right? So this is also something that is circulated very much through memes. And then just very quickly an example of something that I've been looking into a little bit more, which is the kinds of school shooting conspiracies that I mentioned earlier in connection to YouTube. So there's quite a lot of memetic meme content, basically for any type of conspiracy theory, at least that I've seen so far. And this is one for which you see quite a lot of memes. So the idea here is that, as I explained, there is a school shooting, conspiracy theories emerge, and the idea is that the shooting didn't actually take place. You had so-called crisis actors, so people pretending to be victims, and the whole thing was orchestrated and staged by the media and all kinds of other actors. The actors vary a little bit depending on conspiracy theory, but the theory was constructed so as to make it more difficult to engage in conversations about gun control, so to change laws about where are you able to carry a gun and who is able to carry a gun. So you see this kind of content quite a bit, and this guy is one of the big favorites basically in this kind of conspiracy theorizing, David Hogg, who is one of the survivors of the 2018 school shooting in Florida, where 17 students and staff were killed and 17 were injured. And he has been the target very much, as have been many other people, of this crisis actor conspiracy theory. So what is a crisis actor? It's an established term to describe an actor or a volunteer, any person, who basically acts as a fake disaster victim during emergency drills and exercises. And that crisis actor term has been employed in conspiracy theory discussions. So here, for instance, this is a very simple example of how that works. So the meme says that the guy claims to be a school shooting survivor, but he wasn't even there when it happened. And as I said, this very much relates to political conversations, right? About gun control debate, disagreements between political parties as to how to and if we should control gun usage and ownership. And I included another example of, yes, we see it here. So you see this kind of content quite a lot with the appropriate hashtags, of course. And here you see, again, the same guy, David Hogg, together with another school shooting survivor, but here placed in a popular cultural context from the movie E.T. And you see this kind of content circulated quite a lot in certain circles. Of course, you might here see that if this is not something that you're very familiar with, if you encounter this meme online, it doesn't really necessarily say much to you, right? Let's roll out gang CNN needs us again. So you might just scroll past it. It doesn't necessarily say anything to anybody who's not into this stuff. The point here, of course, is that the media, such as CNN, are also involved in this conspiracy theory and helping orchestrate this fake school shooting as an event. Okay, now you may be wondering why I'm telling you all this. So what? I will just briefly say some implications of what I've just described. First, I would say that in terms of research, so there's quite a lot of research on conspiracy theories, of course, from psychology, political science, what have you. And especially in psychology, of course, the question has been, is there something wrong with people who believe in conspiracy theories or entertain them? That's one perspective. But I would say that it's also, based on my experience into looking into these things as well, useful to ask if there should be a role for qualitative research studying actual people's interactions and constructions of conspiracy theories and how that's being done. So, for instance, ethnographic research, where the idea is that you go to where the people are and have a look at what they're doing, or linguistic anthropology, which looks at the ways in which people make meaning and create communities. Because it seems to me, well, the CNN example that we just saw is just one example here, but oftentimes understanding the cultural and political references that people make is actually kind of crucial, so that it makes sense to you what it is that people are talking about, for which purposes, and the different kinds of modes and functions that conspiracy theories may have. So in some cases, at least, it seems to me that it might be more relevant to, well, the conspiracy theory is definitely relevant, but would be important to look at the conspiracy theory in a bigger context. So what kinds of political strategies and implications, for instance, are there, like the QAnon theory, definitely can be used for strategic political purposes. The same with the school shooting conspiracy theories. So the theory itself is interesting, but in the bigger picture, it's about societal debates and political affiliations, etc. And then I wanted to say something else, because the question often arises as to, okay, what do we do about this? You see all kinds of surveys saying so many people believe in conspiracy theories, this is worrying, this is terrible. Well, conspiracy theories are not always dangerous, as we also will hear later today. They're not always false, etc. But they are often discussed in the context of misinformation. And if that is the case, well, it's important, first of all, to have a sense of where and how these things spread, and how to find conspiracy theories and the theorists in the first place. In my experience as a researcher, they can be rather difficult to find sometimes. For one, because the discussion, unless you are really getting into the community, can be very difficult to understand for you. You don't understand the references and the meanings of the things that people say. And secondly, there is the role of the platforms. And this is a rather different perspective from the algorithmic regulation discussion, which is the issue of content moderation. So not too long ago, it was still quite easy to pull up, for instance, anti-vaccination conspiracy theories from Instagram or Facebook, but they have made it so that when you search for such information, only official sources or official sources primarily will show up. So the implication of that is that conspiracy theorists can go further underground and become more invisible, actually, which is kind of an interesting consequence from a researcher's point of view. And that also relates to the hidden virality issue. So hidden virality would refer to things like WhatsApp groups, which is hidden in the sense that it's not in public view, but there can be a lot of hidden spread as well due to the content moderation practices, social media platforms trying to make it more invisible. So then, just two more things. That because of the importance of the cultural and political references and affiliations that conspiracy theories are part of, I would say the fact-checking doesn't take us very far, and you will discover this probably yourself if you try to have a conversation with somebody who you think is a conspiracy theorist. It doesn't take you very far to say, okay, that's wrong, or you don't have the facts. These people's ideas and conspiracy theories can be part of all kinds of networks of meaning and political affiliations, for instance, and in that sense, you need to start talking about the issue from somewhere else, not just whether you have your facts right, necessarily. And then I would say, because memes are typically the kind of thing that people say, oh, but that's kind of unimportant or irrelevant, but they actually have very significant social functions. Very often you see them used for conspiracy purposes, and in the context of filter bubbles, if such things exist, these can be very useful because, as you see with the extremist white supremacist meme that I showed you, it's not directly accessible for outsiders, and therefore this kind of content is actually used as a kind of social gel and as a way of constructing a bubble, if that's how you want to call it, but a group of people, insiders, who are into the same thing. So that also would tell me that we would need different kinds of research if we try to understand how do conspiracy theories work, how do people construct them, and the kinds of functions and features that they have. Okay, now I already went a little bit over time. I'm looking at the organizers for forgiveness. Yes? Okay. Thank you very much. But we can take a couple of questions, right? If any, at this point. Okay, here we go. Is it difficult to research this topic because conspiracy theorists often don't see themselves as conspiracy theorists? Very good question. Yes, absolutely. At least in my experience, well, it of course depends on the aim of your research, but the fact that people don't see themselves as conspiracy theorists, they see themselves as the ones who have the truth and who know how things actually are. If your aim were to find out whether they understand that there's something wrong with their theory or that they're wrong, that can be rather difficult. But on the other hand, for my purposes, for my kind of research, I am more interested in hearing people explain why it is they think the way they do and what it is that they think. So for my kind of research, it's not really a challenge. It's more that when I ask people to tell me things, they tell me so much that I find it difficult to keep up, because conspiracy theorists are often very keen to tell you what they think about things. Okay, next one. What could be consequences of conspiracy theorists getting more invisible? Yeah, so it's not always a danger. That's also a good question. But in some cases, when it relates to extremist activities, extremist political activities, we've seen in the context of QAnon, for example, that there have been some violent acts as well, or at least planned as well. And if you take that perspective, then you could say, yeah, there potentially is some harm from them becoming invisible. Of course, we should bear in mind that it's not like everything was visible to us before. So we shouldn't create a kind of an illusion that because of the internet, everything is visible now. But that is definitely one of the risks there, I would say. Okay, how did misinformation mostly spread before the internet existed? That's a very good one. I wish we would have a historian here to give a little bit more detail. But of course, I mean, I was mentioning the fax machine. The media have always played a role. Misinformation has always existed. That's also something like that some people use the phrase the narcissism of the present, that we tend to think that things have never been this bad or this difficult or this great as they are now, right? So of course it has always existed, but the question partly has to do with speed and spread, right? And also the mobility of people in general, because people used to be a lot more stationary, at least in some areas of the world, than they are now. But it's really a question of speed and scope. So media has always played a role, but now with online spaces, misinformation can spread a lot more quickly and a lot more broadly, or reach wider audiences. Okay. Why do some people believe that most media spread fake news? Yeah, that's also a great question. If only I had a straightforward answer to that. It's also because you also see different explanations for that depending on different conspiracy theories. The idea of fake news, so to speak, is not, of course, new either. And that's, I think, another kind of mistake that we make. So, for example, if you think about Nazi Germany, they used similar kinds of phrases, right, politicians, that it's the lying press or the fake press. So I think one of the reasons is that there are politicians, just like in Nazi Germany, who would use that phrase for their own purposes to delegitimize mainstream media and their reporting. So that's one thing. But of course, there are also specific conspiracy theories, if we go deeper into specific examples, like the school shooting theory, where media is simply identified as being one of the parties in the conspiracy. So it can really depend, but I think that kind of general suspicion towards media is one big explanation for that. Shall we move on? Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so now it's time for our second speaker, Damien Trilling. He is an associate professor at the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Amsterdam, and today he will discuss whether we in the Netherlands need to worry about filter bubbles and what concerns there might be regarding filter bubbles, if any. Please, Damien.
Thank you very much. So I hope this works and goes to my slides now. It does not, I think. Okay, then I'm just going to use the keyboard, also fine. So, well, welcome everyone. It's actually the first time, I think, in 4 months that I'm standing in a real lecture hall, so that is very weird and at the same time very nice, even though I have a limited public that I can literally see. Thanks for inviting me. I'm actually also really happy about the previous talk because there were 2 or 3 things in there that I really want you to hold for a moment. So I just heard the expression mainstreaming of the fringe, and well, remember that because I think it will become important in one of my arguments that I want to make. And even though I'm not a historian at all, I will actually also make an historical argument today, at least partly. And quite contrary to the topic of the Symposium, I'm actually going to argue that we should not talk about filter bubbles and we should not talk about echo chambers. That's not to say that there are no problems, but I do think these are the wrong metaphors, and let me elaborate on that. So let's start with the notion of the filter bubble. And well, I put a nice bubble here. And if we think about this concept, then actually what it comes from is essentially a book by an internet activist, so it's not by a scholar or so, Eli Preiser, who roughly 10 years ago essentially argued that the emergence of our current online media environment would actually lead to everyone being in his own or her own bubble. And the idea would then be that because you are in an information bubble where you only see a very individualized or personalized selection of news, you would be kind of isolated. And I think it is one of those examples that intuitively somehow makes sense, and I think everyone nowadays has heard of that term at least once. It's one of these very, very few examples actually where something related to media theories is actually something that the big, broad public knows, so that's good, and at the same time it's worrying because it's, I think, the wrong metaphor. Because if we look at this bubble here on the screen, there's only one thing that immediately is kind of obvious, and that's the fact that this bubble here is transparent. So I always wondered why one would talk about bubbles for something that actually hinders you seeing what the rest is doing. So that always struck me as problematic. And I actually do think, and I'm going to show you that people maybe have personalized news consumption patterns, but that actually all of that is pretty transparent. The second notion that is often mentioned is the so-called echo chamber. So essentially the idea that in these communities people say things and what they get back is actually a confirmation of what they already think. So I am maybe indeed becoming a member of that conspiracy group in my favorite social media platform, and I'm going to say something about how QAnon is ruling the world or whatever. And all those people will tell me, yeah, indeed, you're right. So I just get back an echo. That term, echo chamber, is sometimes used interchangeably, sometimes not with filter bubble. I tried to get clear definitions of both, and that is very, very hard because there's no real conceptual clarity on it. Sometimes I have the feeling that the notion of a filter bubble is more often used by people who worry about algorithmic personalization, so essentially who worry that the fact how, let's say, the Facebook newsfeed is sorted actually drives people into isolation and reconfirmation, while the term echo chamber is a bit more often used to refer to processes that have to do with self-selection, so essentially the fact that people decide to join that community, and within that community, which is very homophilous, so where people are very much like each other, they get this confirmation. So we could say that the notion of an echo chamber very much highlights that idea that people connect with others who they already agree with. And that is actually something that is not that new. We also know that from very different contexts. We know that when studying like how friendships form, all of that, people tend to connect and like people who are a bit like them. And of course, the problem is, as we also heard in the talk before, that if we live in an environment where it's very easy actually to find these groups, even for the most extreme characteristics, then these, let's say, like-minded community are more easy to form. And that, of course, in the end can reinforce your ideas and beliefs because you get a distorted idea of reality, right? If everyone around you tells you that you are right, then at the one point you will believe that you are right, even more than you already were in the beginning. I would argue that essentially all these things that we talk about, whether it's a filter bubble or an echo chamber, that there's another, let's say, audio metaphor that's maybe better. We could maybe say that all of that is actually about feedback loops, right? So if I would take this microphone now and put it in front of that speaker, then you will get a terrible noise because the input is actually then re-amplified, right? It's like a circular thing. And it's the same reasoning here, of course, that the input gets amplified because I get either, in this manual example, I get confirmation by people who already think the same, or in the, let's say, filter bubble metaphor, the idea is a bit that this algorithm, whatever that may be, would reinforce what I already thought by actually sharing the same content again. So it's more like a feedback loop. That's, I think, the general concern that people have, even though they talk about bubbles and chambers, and, well, these bubbles might not be that closed. So filter bubbles, indeed, as I said, are the idea that this is mainly due to algorithms. So those actually select content, filter it based on my beliefs that reinforces my ideas. Essentially, a feedback loop. So I promised some history. Here's some history. Sorry for those who don't speak Dutch. I didn't find the English language picture of that. So what always struck me is this idea why people thought that this is something that is happening especially now. So if we go back half a century, or actually by now more than half a century, then the Dutch society was very much organized in terms of pillars, right? So if you're a Catholic, then high chances that you were in a Catholic sports club, that you were attending a Catholic school, of course Catholic church, but also Catholic media. You had your own party, all of that. And I would argue that if you lived in such a society, it would be much more sense to be worried that not everyone is exposed to the same kind of set of opinions and values. And that means that if we talk about, let's say, online platforms leading to people living next to each other and fragmenting and all of that, then we really need to have a good argument what reference point or baseline we're going to compare it to. And of course, you could not say, well, maybe somewhere in the 1980s everything was better when literally almost everyone was watching the 8 o'clock evening news. Maybe. But I think one other problem with this filter bubble and echo chamber metaphor is that these reference point is actually almost never made clear. And I would argue that there are a lot of historical reference points where we probably lived more isolated and got more of this reinforcement of our own being right. So that might not be new, okay? It might not be well defined, but still, of course, you could now say still the mechanism makes kind of sense, right? We all know that. We have seen these online platforms. We know that people radicalize. And the general idea that either people or a technical system that might actually reinforce your behavior or reinforce what you did based on your clicks, that could have such a polarizing effect, for instance, that is not completely unreasonable to think. And again, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that we could come up with. So, for instance, there's the example of YouTube. By the way, I have to say that it is a bit outdated, but I still put this example on here because it got a lot of attention. The fact that, and that has been studied by, well, some researchers, but also by essentially journalists. So I put the journalistic screenshot on here, where it was essentially studied what happens if you click on the recommendations you get at the end of a YouTube video. And basically the finding was, and I have to say that in the meantime, the YouTube recommendation algorithm was changed, so it's not exactly like that anymore, but you could show that if you started watching some videos, let's say slightly right of center, so not an extreme position, something that's completely within our political system, that within just a few clicks you would arrive at some pretty extreme thing, and that people would then get more and more extreme content. So the mechanism, as I said, is kind of plausible. So the problem is, or the question is, why are we not doomed then, right? So if this is basically such a loop where everyone gets more and more extreme content, then one would expect that either this effect is really small, or within a few time steps, maybe a year, maybe 2, maybe 10, everyone would have been radicalized. But we are not, right? So we still don't have any civil war. So, well, it seems that it is not that simple, right? It seems that even though you can show these effects, you probably cannot draw the conclusion that people are completely closed off. And one very big reason for that is this. So this is from the Reuters Digital News Report. That's a big study that's done in, I think, 25 countries or so every, I don't know, I think every second year, but I don't remember exactly. There are many other comparable studies, but what this shows is essentially how, what are the most frequently used news sources. And if you look at these percentages, then you already see how large the top categories are, right? So even though we have this feeling, well, everything's digital now, well, 60% of the people still watch the traditional public broadcasters' evening news. Or even if we go online, then 42% visit Nyheterna, the biggest news site. So this idea that everyone has a completely individualized diet does not completely make sense. And we know actually from other studies that those people who use more extreme sources are also the ones who go to mainstream sources. So that means that even though they may do that in order to debunk that and to complain that everything is biased in this mainstream media and everything, the idea that they would not be exposed to it or that they would not be aware of something else is just not empirically shown. So it seems that even though people may radicalize in their opinions, they are not ignorant of what's happening around them. That to some extent also holds true for social media, because if we look at the percentages here, it seems that they are much lower, right? So yeah, social media are important in today's environment. I don't want to downplay it, but it is not the case. It's simply not the case that the majority of the population uses those as a main news source. They use it for all kinds of things. Almost everyone uses some of these media, but they are not the main news source. At least not with us, right? It may be in some countries differently. These kind of things are, of course, a bit more complex. So we can say that most people, in fact, use more than one news source. And that means that while radicalization due to the connections they might have on social media and or algorithmic recommendation can be potentially a problem, we shouldn't talk about bubbles or echo chambers because I think they are the wrong metaphors. It is not the case that people are not aware of what's happening outside. Let me briefly show you some ways or some, well, let's say snapshots of things that we did to understand that better. So one thing is actually, and I have to say I'm not a computer scientist, but I do think that a lot of people have quite some misconception of how recommendation and these kind of things work. So for instance, this is the homepage of the Volkskrant, a big quality newspaper in the Netherlands. And there was, at the time when we did that study, on the top right, this box, aanbevolen artikelen, so recommended articles. We were in this unique situation that actually this box was filled by hand, by editors, while at the same time they were testing different algorithmic solutions to fill that box. And they shared for 2 weeks or something like that their data with us. So we could essentially see whether what the editors would fill in these things, so the traditional way of doing it differs in terms of, for instance, diversity from what an algorithm would do. And they tried several things that are kind of industry standard. And what you essentially saw there, and I'm not going to go through all these, these lines, but the main takeaway is that these lines are very similar, right? So what we tried to figure out was, is it the case that an algorithm shows you all the time the same, while a human would be much better in actually showing you a diverse range of perspectives, and that's not the case. That's not what we found. So essentially, I think this second sentence there, that's how I was imagine that. So people think of how recommendation works as, well, you clicked on an article about right-wing politics, so you're getting exactly the same again. That's, of course, what you could do. You could, of course, if someone just bought a barbecue, say, hey, maybe you want to buy a second one, but probably you better recommend someone to buy a cold beer to enjoy with it, or maybe a table or something like that. So also news recommender systems do not, just the fact that they're algorithmic does not have to imply that they use a very naive logic that basically tries to pull people into a political corner. So we tried to understand that better, and we did some experiments. So we actually set up a news site on our own, where we essentially filled that site, and on the left it's a screenshot for a web version, on the right is basically how it looks on a mobile phone, but we essentially filled that with real-time news. So what happens is that we asked 250 people or something like that to use that for 2 weeks. And we divided them into several groups. And some people essentially just got a random selection of news. Some people got something that was very aggressively tailored towards what they actually indicated themselves as their preference. Something else was based on their clicks and so on. I spare you all the technical details, but we also asked them in the beginning, like, hey, what kind of topics do you actually like and so on. And what we actually see is, because we could, of course, measure how diverse what they really saw was, also in these algorithmic conditions, is that. And the only thing that's here interesting is this yellow line. So basically, you see on the x-axis how diverse they were inclined to consume news. So essentially, someone on the very right was someone who basically said, I really like everything. Someone on the left was someone like, I only want to read about this one issue. And on the y-axis, you see how diverse what they really were reading over the course of these 2 weeks was. And you see that whatever kind of recommendations we applied, that did not really matter, because, of course, people could also click on something else, right? So we recommended a lot, but some things were also just randomly on there. And only those people who essentially said themselves, well, you know what, I am going to configure the system in such a way that I actually click on, don't show me this, don't show me this, don't show me this. Only those people really actually did consume less diverse news. So basically, what I want to point out here is that people do have agency, right? So they still can click on non-recommended articles, and therefore, unless people actively take the effort to filter things out, the overall diversity does not necessarily decrease. So now it may sound as if I say, well, everything is great and we shouldn't have to worry about anything, and I think that's not true, right? So indeed, if we have a very badly designed platform or algorithm, then that can have negative effects. It can lead to polarization. It can lead to radicalization. I don't want to downplay the example of YouTube that and the radicalization of some viewing trajectories there. But I do think that the bubble is the wrong metaphor for that. And now we come back actually to the first talk. If, after all, these conspiracy theorists would stay within their bubble, then this whole idea of this being spread more, that it would become mainstream, that's kind of the opposite of a bubble, right? So the problem seems to me that there are groups in which people can radicalize and that then actually can spread this content through a much larger network. That's the problem, and that's kind of the opposite of highly closed bubbles, I would say. So let's end on an optimistic note, and that is that I actually think that we can just design better systems also if we want. So this is just one example from well, some people I know who are working on, for instance, checking out in how far they can use theories of democracy to guide their decisions on what kind of news recommender system, a news recommender system should recommend. So that brings us back a bit to that idea that it depends on the design of the system, and that most of them are not or do not necessarily have to be naive systems that simply reinforce what someone clicked on, but that you can actually do much better by trying to find a balance by serving the user's interests and balancing that also with achieving an overall goal in terms of what you, for example, think of the diversity that a news site should exhibit and things like that. And, well, thanks. I need to read it out, of course. So the question is, you said bubble or echo chambers is not the right metaphor. What do you think is a more accurate metaphor? So I do think that if we're interested in describing the process that people get increasingly confirmation of what they already think or already do based on either joining some group or some algorithmic recommendation, I think the better metaphor is the one of a feedback loop, where we basically focus more on the fact that there's a reinforcing process and focus less on the fact whether that leads to kind of a thick wall towards the outside. Another one that one could use is one that my colleague Judith Möller talks about a lot. So she likes to talk about fringe bubbles, which emphasizes the fact that most people do not live in a bubble, but that it is indeed the case or possible to think of a small percentage of the population that actually may live in isolated extremist communities. In what ways do you think misconceptions about recommendation systems can be resolved? Well, it's always, of course, this boring standard answer that you say, well, okay, media literacy and all of that, but to some extent it is that. But I also given that we are on a university here, I really do think that we should, and again, I'm not anyone with a computer science background or something like that myself, yet I do think that it would help if more people also from a wide range of the disciplines would learn at least a bit of the basics of how technical systems work, how basically programmers work, how coding works. Just a bit of technical knowledge, I think, can help. And I think we too much have a distinction and a division sometimes between, let's say, the more looking for the English word for humanities-like approach and a more tech approach. And I think that you can cure some misunderstandings by bringing that together more. Are there any examples of offline echo chambers in other countries, just like polarization in the Netherlands, since polarization is a Dutch concept? Well, actually, I had to give a talk in Switzerland 2 weeks ago, and it seems that they also had polarization, something that I was not completely aware of. So I do think that indeed the polarization is a very Dutch example, but I do think that also in other countries, even though it was not that extreme maybe, and maybe even though it was not as clear-cut, I do think that similar things have existed in a lot of countries. I also do think that if you think of maybe, but again, this is not my main area of expertise, but if you think of, let's say, small, isolated rural communities, I could imagine that, that similar things would apply there. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. And I am not sure whether I need to give the word to someone, but I already see, well, great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else will have a 5-minute break. And then please come back for some more exciting content. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We have 2 more interesting talks to go. And the first one, unfortunately, is unable to be with us here today physically, but through the miracle of technology, we will hear from Jelle van Buren, who works as a lecturer and researcher at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. And in his talk, he will discuss what conspiracy theories exactly are and the extent to which they promote systemic hatred. He will also talk about whether conspiracy theories are a real danger to our safety.
I hope the technique works by now and that you can hear me and maybe even at a certain moment see me. Thank you for the invitation towards this symposium on conspiracy theories. What I will try to do is problematize a little bit the whole concept of conspiracy, try to explain what the functions are of conspiracy theories, and at the end of the session, I will look into the question whether or not we should be worried. All right. At the end of the session, as I was explaining, I will try to look into the question whether we should be worried about conspiracy, and especially from a perspective of risk and danger. What is the problem with this term conspiracy? It's a rather negative connotation when it's being used in most of the discussions we currently have about the phenomenon. It's about idiots, stupid people, people without analytical skills like we have, or maybe even dangerous people. So there's always something like a delegitimation of certain opinions by claiming that they are conspiracy theories. It is not a compliment when you talk about conspiracy theories or when you accuse certain people of having conspirational beliefs. However, there's one big problem. There is really a fluid border between critical thinking, critical political thinking, critical social thinking, and conspiracy beliefs. And believe me, there's no academic formula to draw the line. Sometimes it's very difficult to really demarcate when a critical line of reasoning goes into more conspirational thinking. And that is one of the problems we have to deal with. Um, Next slide, please. The same problem also sometimes runs through academics, because there are quite some academic definitions that also assume that conspiracy theories are false by default. So the starting point is that a conspiracy theory cannot be true. Other academic studies assume that conspiracy theories are problematic as such. And there are also quite some studies assuming that something is wrong with people believing in such theories. So there are a lot of psychological studies, for instance, trying to figure out why do these people believe in theory, in conspiracy theories? What is wrong with them? Well, I don't think it's very helpful if we start with already a biased perspective. So in my own research, I try to use a definition that is as sober and factual as possible. And if you go to the next slide, I will show you the definition I am using. It's not my own definition. I borrowed it from Brettig. And in my opinion, conspiracy theories are constructed stories that explain a situation that is considered to be highly threatening or unjust, whether it's on the personal level or on the societal level, as the deliberate outcome of a group working secretly with malicious intent. So in this definition, we do not make any statement about whether the constructed story is true or false. We do not make any statement about the people who are making and believing in these constructed stories. And we do not make any statement about whether believing in conspiracy constructions is dangerous or riskful or whatsoever. We try to use a balanced, open definition to look at a phenomenon in order to try to explain it, because that is, in my opinion, the main objective for the form of science that I'm trying to conduct. So if you go to the next slide, why is it important to have this open mind when you look at conspiracy theories? Well, for instance, then you can look for an answer to the question, why do people believe in conspiracy constructions? So what is the function of conspiracy construction, both on the individual level, but also on the societal level? And we know that there are at least three different functions: an epistemic function, an existential function, and a social function. So if we go to the next slide and look at these epistemic functions of conspiracy theories, this has to do about a basic need of people to understand a world, and especially in times of uncertainties and crisis, or in a time of lacking or contradictory information. We do want to understand the world. We want to have a basic story, a basic narrative that explains the world. And we are always looking for causal explanations. There must be a reason for bad things happening to us or to other people. Or is it just coincidence or bad luck? No way. There must be a reason for bad things happening. And especially a big event is in need of a big explanation. We don't accept that pure coincidence results in bad things from happening. So an important epistemic function of conspiracy theories that also explain why a lot of people, one way or the other, do believe in those conspiracy narratives. If you go to the next slide, you can look into the existential functions of conspiracy theories. And this is related, for instance, to a lack of social and political control a lot of people are experiencing today. We want to have a certain amount of control or a sense of control and agency when it comes to our own lives, when it comes to society, when it comes to the question how we relate to others, how we relate to society around us, but also in order to relate to political change, social developments, etc., etc. And this is also related to a concept we use called ontological security, a basic need of people to feel safe and secure in the world, in their own environment, in the communities, or in their homes. And conspiracy constructions, especially in times when there's a lot of uncertainty, a lack of future, a lot of uncertainty about what is going on, a lack of explanation. People want to have this sense of control and agency. And conspiracy constructions are always a master narrative about good and evil. This has to do with sense making, making sense of the world around us. It's very basic human need. And that's also why you see in a lot of conspiracy constructions a religious dimension or a spiritual dimension because it is related to sense making and meaning making. And conspiracy constructions offer sense and meaning to people. If you go to the next slide, and if we look into the social functions of conspiracy constructions, well, this is all about the positive image of the self and the in-group. It's always interesting to look at the ways people define themselves. They are the truth seekers. They are the children of the light. They are the true resistance fighters in the world. They are the only ones who have been awakened. So being part of a community of like-minded people is a very important social function of conspiracy constructions. And the term awakening, of course, that is also this spiritual or religious connotation, is describing this effect that at a certain moment you are awakening and you become part of a community, maybe elite community who knows the truth with a capital T. And let's not forget, it's also highly exciting to search for the truth, individual, but also with a group. It's very exciting to try to figure out whether or not a book missile could have tear down an airplane in the skies above the Ukraine. So we all like detectives, we all like political thrillers on television. It's part of our popular culture, and also conspiracy narratives gives you the opportunity to be part of this exciting search for the truth. So you become part of an elite movement. But if you go to the next slide, it's also important to realize that within conspiracy constructions, there's always a critique on power relations. And that is about questions like who decides what is true? Who is considered to be an expert? And if you look back in history, you can see regimes of truth, and they are always contested, and they should be contested. Long ago, it was the church or religious leaders who decided what was truth and what was false. They were the experts on almost everything. And I think we are glad that that has been contested and that it has been changed. So every society in every historical context has a regime of truth. They're established but also contested. And within these conspiracy constructions, if you look through the lines, you can also see that they are a form of coded social critique, a critique on power relations, a critique on who decides what is true in a given society. And if you could go to the next slide, I can give you some examples of this critique on power relations, partly related to Corona, for instance. You can have a lot of critique on the power of big pharma, for instance. That is legitimate critique. You can criticize that political power has been dispersed to all kinds of international fora in which it's very hard to have any influence as an ordinary citizens who are most of the time not transparent, or in which it's very difficult to exercise some basic form of political control, or who are not accountable to the people. And let's not forget, there are a lot of examples of real conspiracies in the world. Maybe not with the magnitude that a lot of conspiracy constructions are assuming, but people working together secretly to further their own interest against the interest of others. That is not just something that people invent. History is full of conspiracies. Look, for instance, when it goes, QAnon, for instance, has been mentioned several times this afternoon. But there are too many examples of child abuse by very powerful men who were protected by other powerful men, whether it's in economics or in politics. So there are real conspiracies. Let's don't forget that. And a critique on science is also legitimate. We don't have all the answers. And sometimes, and if you look back at history, but also today, science can also be a function of power or a function of the status quo and can also be biased. So also critique on science as such is a legitimate position. If we go to the next slide, of course, you don't have to agree with all those critical statements. You don't have to agree with a critical political or social analysis. However, if people make this kind of analysis, and maybe these analyses are going too far, but if you look at the basic elements that are being addressed about power, about injustice, is that a sign of mental illness? Is that a sign of lack of education? Is it a sign of risk and danger? I don't think so. So I think it's very important to have a balanced perspective on conspiracy theories, and that we really try to understand what it is that they are addressing. Next slide, please. Is there no danger connected to conspiracy thinking? Well, of course, it's not without any risk and danger. And that is when certain mechanisms are coming to the foreground. For instance, there's a tendency in conspiracy constructions to create this fundamental opposite between us and them. And that can be a riskful mechanism. There's a tendency of scapegoating, and we know from history what the effects of scapegoating can be. Sometimes we see apocalyptic fantasies as part of conspiracy constructions, almost a desire to have these end of the times battles, these apocalyptic fantasies. And in the long term, but it's very difficult to get a good grip on it, but in the long term, it's undermining institutional, societal, and interpersonal trust. So yeah, there are some risks and dangers connected to conspiracy constructions. But the question is that because there are conspiracy constructions, or are we talking about extremist mechanisms that we see also in other political affiliations, for instance, or political religious affiliations? So can we blame conspiracy for these kind of tendencies, or is it more a form of extremism? Please go to the next slide. Again, it's not without risk or danger. Last year, we see some examples of the violent potential of conspiracy environments or conspiracy movements, issues with public order, but a problem with public order does not mean that society is collapsing. We have the right police to deal with that. We see examples of doxing, publishing the addresses, for instance, of politicians or people who are working in the health department or policeman. That can also be very threatening because that comes to your home. Some violence against objects like the 5G network that has been set in fire by some activists. And we know some examples of violence against people. So it's not without risk, but we should not consider conspiracy constructions as such as a big risk to society. So if you go to the last slides, my message is be aware of a moral panic over conspiracy constructions. By now, we seem to think that conspiracy as such is a big problem, is highly threatening to society. But in my view, conspiracy constructions as such do not cause political and societal problems. They are more a reaction to these problems, and they signal distrust, anxieties, and grievances that are part of our society. And I think it's better to understand them as a wake-up call because they signal distrust, they signal anxieties, they signal grievances, then consider it to be risky, full of danger, or the work of madmen. That was my presentation. I believe the last slide has questions on it. All right, we have set up an SMS system for our communication, so very modern. The first question, how can we increase the credibility of science? Good question. I think we have to look again, but that's really a political discussion about how we finance, for instance, the research we are doing. What is the influence of all kinds of third parties we need by now to get our budgets in order to do our research? Are we sure that research is totally independent? The research agendas partly are being at least influenced in terms of the topics we look into by the organizations that finance our research. So I think it would be good if there would be more independent sources of money for our research and that you trust the professionals in academic to come up with good, relevant and socially relevant research. So I think that would be very good, but maybe it's also good. What I see sometimes is that science or the outcomes of research also have become something of a public relations campaign for universities. I think science should also be modest. We try our best to produce valid knowledge, but we don't know everything, and we have different outcomes of research, sometimes contradictory outcomes of research, but that's the basic of scientific research. It's always knowledge that can be and should be contested by other academics. And maybe we should explain this better to society and stay away from all this public relations shit about how wonderful the newest research outcomes are. We can contribute to society, but we should also be modest to a certain extent. I have a new question on the SMS. I will read it out loud to you. Donald Trump was very anti-establishment in his election period, but became president himself. During his presidency, he also had a large following that had anti-establishment sentiment. How can it be explained that these people supported him while he himself became part of the establishment? Good question. Then we are in the field of populism. I think in general, and that's going on for a long time, especially in the United States, the best way of running for office is by posing yourself as against the office and the system and the elite and the establishment. And people almost wanted to believe that their man or woman indeed is going to help them, will be on their side instead of on the side of the establishment. And if you see how President Trump presented himself during his presidency, he was constantly posing as the anti-establishment guy, drawing the swamp, the fake news media, blaming the fake news media, etc., etc. He kept on his appearance as the anti-establishment guy who had to fight the deep state, the real powers in America, and the deep state and the QAnon movement are intimately connected. So that is a way of being part of the establishment, being the most powerful person within the political establishment, but you can keep on this, you can keep on pretending that you are in fact not part of the establishment. And that's a classic pose of all populist politicians. I have another question. In what way could we decrease the negative connotations around the word conspiracy? Yeah, it's a good one, but also highly difficult. Sometimes I would like to stop using the word conspiracy at all, but one way or the other, we are also stuck with it. Maybe it's good to, if you try to talk to people or if you want to have a discussion with people, be aware that as soon as you use the word conspiracy, there will be no discussion whatsoever because of all these negative connotations. And the whole trick is to have a discussion on all these issues that are behind the conspiracy narratives, the grievances, the injustice, the anger, the frustration, uncertainties about the future. And these are things we can all talk about. So in the academic world, try to use a definition that is as neutral as possible. That is one way to deal with it. Also be a little bit, how do you say it? Sometimes the whole idea is that there's something wrong with people who believe in conspiracy constructions, and that we try to find out what it is that is wrong with these people. It can be a very creative approach to ask the question from time to time, what is wrong with people who are still believing in the mainstream media, for instance? To have a different perspective, to get a better open discussion about all these phenomena that are in between, after, behind conspirational thinking. And maybe, hopefully, at the end, that will lead to a more neutral connotation when we use the word conspiracy theory or conspiracy construction. And now I get the message that these were all the questions. So thank you for listening to me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you very much, Jelle. And now on to our final speaker, Cynthia Lim, who is an assistant professor in the Multimedia Computing Group of Delft University of Technology, and she will focus on her interest in digitally supported perspective broadening and how the challenge of discovering unknown content is highly non-trivial, requiring insight into both algorithmic and human factors, as well as interdisciplinary systems perspectives.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having invited me out here. It's quite nice to have these different speakers before me. There were already these discussions about mainstreams and fringes. There were discussions about designing better systems. There was just now also the discussion that conspiracy theories and critical thinking or contesting some power structures also are rather close. Then Damian literally called for a computer scientist to come in and say a bit more about algorithmic aspects. Well, I guess that's me, so I'll try. Now, the thing is, I haven't actually been working on conspiracy theories. I'm a person who's been working on trustworthy AI questions in the more multimedia context, especially in the music context, as I am also a trained pianist. Still, my interest in there, and especially the interest in filtering, recommending these items that are not so easy to find, I think there are quite a few themes in there and some challenges in there that are actually quite close to the challenges we are speaking about out here. And as we are kicking some terms we don't like, Damian already didn't like the filter bubble and the echo chamber. Now, I'm always this person that gets asked about the algorithms. I also really don't like that. As I said, you need to have systems perspectives here. It's never one single master algorithm. It's a bigger system with bigger considerations around it. So let's stick to we have to design better systems take. And let me also speak about some of these systems, actually, that I've encountered, both in the digital world, but first of all, also in the actual physical world while I was a musician, and where I still am a musician. So I got interested in these large collections and archives from my pianist background. About 10 years ago, I was in the end of my conservatoire education. I had to do some master's research, and then you have to do some practice-based research, as that is called, in the conservatoire, where you think of what you are performing and how you maybe can do some research around that. And as a pianist, I play classical music written by composers. Typically, they are long dead, and I reinterpret what they once wrote down. So I always find it very interesting to try to see how should I interpret that. I only have those notes, and I have to turn it into audio, into something that's my interpretation. And one composer that's quite famous if you're a pianist is Frédéric Chopin. And one thing struck me in the music of Chopin, and that is this type of writing. Typically he writes notes, and then there is this huge string of small notes, ornaments. And when I talked about that with my piano teacher, he said, yeah, it's indeed ornamentation, so it's not like the main thought of the notes, but something that you have to play, but a bit as a side thing. That was interesting, because as a classical musician, you are normally taught to very much stick to the notes. But if an ornament is not something like the regular thought of music, does it mean that you can actually maybe do something different than what is written out there? Secondly, I was also being told that Chopin was very much interested and inspired by and in bel canto opera, the opera that was famous at that time. And then they said, yeah, and these ornaments, they are also a bit like what singers would use to do. But then I was looking again, and that was, well, this is quite a few notes. And if you are an opera singer, you have to breathe surely at some point. So definitely if you would execute that the way a singer would do, probably you wouldn't just play all these notes after each other, even though as a pianist you can, because your breathing and your music making is not quite in the same synchronization per se. So I got intrigued by that, and I tried to look more into that for my master's research. And I started reading some of these old books and some of these old texts that were speaking about how Chopin was teaching and how he was performing. Then also I found some books that were speaking about opera singing in that time. And then again, Chopin died in 1849, way before the recording era. So I can't listen back to what people did back then. But there were these more pedagogical treatises, there were these discussions, these reports of how people performed back in the days. And indeed, when they spoke about opera, singers used to have quite some personal styles, and they indeed didn't quite take the notes very literally. Even if you can't read notes, if something would be written like this, there was this famous singer, Cynthia Lim, she was one of the examples back then. And in one of these pedagogical treatises, it was said, like, well, if the notes were there like that in this particular area, what she really would do would be this. And even if you can't read notes, you can tell that that's something quite different. Similarly, more of these old books that were there. This is Lablache, 1840, also a famous opera singer of that time. And he was also making these pedagogical books in which he said, well, if something gets noted down like this, of course, as a well-trained singer, you will play it like this. Which again is not quite the same. The way you transition, the way you play the notes, it's not quite as literal as we would take those texts now these days. So that was fascinating. And what was even more fascinating was that many of these resources back in those days, 10 years ago, were in specialized archives. I literally was in the Netherlands Music Institute with my bad mobile phone at that time making pictures of these old books. Now they became public domain available online. On the left, one of the texts I was also looking at, that was the review of Chopin's first performance in Paris. It was an unknown musician at the time who got the review. And that was all now available online, public domain, but it's really, really hard to find it. Because you have to know that it exists. It's among this big sea of other information that we have there, in the middle of the news and the cat videos and everything else. And actually, even in terms of recordings, there are recordings of students of Chopin. So it's not like a first-degree interpretation, but still, the student of Chopin actually indeed was playing a bit more in that style that apparently also the opera singers did. And if you happen to know that these obscure recordings exist, you might find them, but you won't find them if you just go to YouTube, search for a Chopin piece, and look at the first page. These are things that are obscure, that are badly indexed, that people don't really know about, and that maybe even from an objective quality criterion perspective are poor. They're creaky. They are not high-quality audio. So I found it quite interesting. That really inspired me to think of how can I get such things surfaced? Because I happen to now find this, because I happen to look into this problem. And otherwise it's gone, and I will never know. So I got interested into that, and first of all, especially into also questions of digital representation. If we look at music services, places like Spotify, you really see that you get systems there that are organized, thought from a pop music perspective. You have these fields, the title, the artist, and the album. If you search for songs and you search explicitly, you have your text box, and you have to indicate some text that would fit into any of these boxes. Now, as a classical player, as said, I render music from a composer. If Cynthia Lim plays a nocturne of Chopin, who is the artist? And if there are multiple movements in a piece, which you have a lot in classical music, how do you put that in this type of setting? So it's really hard for anyone into classical music to work with systems like this if you have to query very explicitly. That's been a complaint that was voiced for a very long time. It's not just in that world, it's also in the jazz world, where you have many standards that are called the same, in many world musics, where you have dance forms that are called the same. But it never really got fixed. And why did it never really got fixed? Because all these people with those strange interests, those were just small segments of the market. So actually, while I was a PhD student, I got to do some internships with Google at the then service called Google Music. And as a cheap intern, finally, I was allowed to implement the notion of a composer for classical music into the scheme, because I was cheap. But I was warned, and I spoke to people there like, yeah, you know, it's such a small amount of audience, it's not worth it. Why would you do such a big thing, changing the whole ontology of music just for that small segment? But you do shut people out, and you do shut certain types of content out. Then also, we do have to realize, as said before, we have a world of information overload. This news we speak about, the conspiracy theories that are being voiced, the memes, they're in the same places as maybe these types of content. And if we think how much info really is there are massive catalogs in all these services that we use. The latest stats of YouTube, 500 hours of videos uploaded per minute. No human soul is going to look through all of that. Back in the days, we also didn't have full knowledge, but we kind of accepted we had physical limitations of our libraries. And if they wouldn't have all the knowledge, we would go to the next library. We don't have that. We just have us and the internet. And we can't look at everything anymore. So it is indeed necessary that we as users somehow get our attention a bit more focused, because we can't look at everything. And the ideal typically would be an image like this, if you also look at how recommender systems and search engines are built, that we have a user, and the user actually is in a very lazy, comfortable position, and we try to narrow down their interests to that what is deemed relevant. And typically we can only see that if they click and if they engage with it. As for looking a little bit into the engine there, I won't deeply go into algorithms, but if we speak recommendation, there typically are two main strands of approaches. One of them is the content-based approach that looks, based on what people consume, at what some properties are of these products and if you can use them again. So this is a good example. If you're in clothing, you see that quite a lot. If you look at a particular dress, you have these similar items being pushed, and they are all dresses of kind of a similar style with a similar color. What is a bit more of a popular stance, if you look at how people treat data, is the collaborative filtering approach. The approach we see a lot on web shops. People who bought item X also bought item Y. If we have this interaction of other users who liked certain items or disliked certain items, if there's a new user coming in, Alice is quite close to user 2, so if we wonder if she would like the cake, well, given that she was very close to user 2 before, probably she will like that cake. The advantage of this type of method often has been mentioned as that you don't have to think so much about particular sub-features, which might be too narrow, that whenever someone consumes something and someone is similar, apparently it's good, even if we don't really know why. So that's why this type of approach and thinking was and has been and still is quite popular in the recommender world. In practice, we typically also mix. There is no single algorithm, as I said. So we might use a bit of this type of data and maybe even a bit of content too, and ultimately make systems like that. But there are issues with that. How to interpret this interaction data? What do we really want to get out of it? And also, as for the user, what does that user do and show to us? In 2017, something very interesting happened with Netflix. They used to have a 5-star system in terms of showing whether you probably would like items, and they moved that to a thumbs up down system that we have these days. Why was it? Back then there were these articles about it, and one of the managers said, well, you know what happened? You tell me you give 5 stars to this documentary about Ukraine and 3 stars to the latest Adam Sandler movie, and you watch that Adam Sandler movie 10 times as much. So what you do and what you say are different things, and the interpretation of Netflix was, we go with what you do. I find it a bit problematic, I'll come back to that later, but it is a reasoning that you could see, and that as a platform that needs to keep audience engaged is really not that strange of a thought. Now, one issue that we do see in user behavior is that we always have this risk in these very large collections of a rich get richer effect. This is a graph from 2008, when we still had a lot of local digital collections, when streaming wasn't as fully mainstream as today. Users on Last.fm who were sharing what they played locally. And there already you saw this phenomenon of a small head and a long tail that you also hear a lot in literature. So few items get a lot of engagement and many items hardly any. So the interest of people typically is limited to a rather small part and then a lot of fringe. Now, if we think of this collaborative filtering approach, if we think of just looking at what people do and keep doing and give these strong signals about, if that is all your info, you do get this risk that you might make that head even bigger but smaller, and the rest even more fringe and away. And that is what I've been finding interesting. So we know what people find relevant, but what does that really mean? And also, everything else that they never looked at, is that irrelevant? Is that something you never should bring up? Or is it something that we should maybe still try to get in there? And there are techniques that try to do this. There have been concerns about representation. Damian already gave a nice example in the news. Spotify also is trying this. So one nice story, and this was from the Benelux manager of Spotify, who I spoke to a while ago. He said that he noticed that people weren't actually actively searching for Motown music. But then they made this playlist and they called it Happy Tunes and they put a lot of Motown in it. And suddenly everyone started listening to it. So there are these different ways to maybe package what people don't ask for in a way that's still acceptable, where you can still push that a bit. But that gives, of course, a big role to the human curator who decides what gets into this and what gets promoted to the first page. And that is a question where you then start maybe speaking about these power challenging situations. And again, I will first go back to an anecdote as a musician. 9 years ago, 2012, my duo partner, Emmy Sturm, she plays the violin, had her final exam. We had to play a recital, and her teacher said, maybe play the violin sonata of Matthijs Vermeulen. Vermeulen was a Dutch composer who had generally been a bit shunned because it was a very critical review writer in newspapers. He was extremely polemic in his writing. He wrote this violin sonata in 1925. The first premiere of this piece was 1963. No one dared touching it because he was tainted and it was a difficult piece. First recording way after his death by the violin teacher of Emmy in the 80s, I believe, and no one really knew the piece. He said, maybe play that. I think it's something for you as a duo. We did. It was difficult music, but we got into it, we liked it, and ultimately we were very happy with it. And then she graduated, all fine. We became this young talent that got to play, and we wanted to bring this piece to more people. Now we had finally mastered it. And the concert halls really didn't want that. Whenever we came with, can we play Matthijs Vermeulen? No, that's contemporary music, that's really difficult. Audiences won't come, just play Beethoven. That was typically what we got back. But yeah, I mean, we invested so much time in this piece, we liked it, we wanted to bring it through, and then ultimately, we snuck it in by auditioning for a talent program in this country. If you would get through, you would get carte blanche to play in all the big concert halls in the country with the radio on top of it. So we auditioned, not with Vermeulen. And then when we got in, we said, okay, and now we're going to play Matthijs Vermeulen all over the country. And when we did that, our coaches were like, wait, what? This difficult contemporary big piece, are you sure? Yeah, we were sure, but it was still really, really sensitive, apparently. But then they encouraged us also to think more about how to, again, package that. You can indeed put it in the very contemporary music fringe, or you can maybe co-program it with other things. You can also share why you liked it so much. So we were encouraged to make these own home videos, basically, where we were talking about our tour, but also really talking about why we so much liked that piece. And in our stage presence, we also started working a bit more with more playful types of interactions, where we also had a bit of theater next to that. And people loved that. And actually, after 10 times playing Vermeulen on all these stages, people said, well, actually, it's not that bad, really. So we got to actually ultimately make the second recording and to even be invited for playing that piece in other concert halls. So it is possible, but that's a 5-year route. And as a computer scientist, that takes a little too long for me to do that with every single piece I encounter. So that's why, again, I'm quite interested in seeing if maybe in the digital world, we could also do something about that. But I think this already illustrates whether someone judges if someone is canon is already also a problematic thing. And this piece just had no right of existence in the first place. And we had to push a lot, present it in different ways to convince. That's maybe not even unlike what conspiracy theorists do, really. Indeed, that type of communicating, getting people on board, it's very close. But I just want to show that this is a problem that's real and not only there. Looking at the historical perspective, I've also been working quite a bit with libraries and archives in this country, especially the National Library, Koninklijke Bibliotheek, and Muziekweb, our big archive of music that was released in this country. And they have so much material that no one ever asks for. But 400 years of digitized newspapers, it's 12 billion pages more of that. You can go on the internet to delver.nl and find it. All the music ever released in the Netherlands from an archival purpose, they have to digitize that. That's more than 500,000 CDs. A lot of stuff that's just sitting there because it has to be archived and no one knows about it. And I thought, that's interesting. Maybe if I can look at the historical newspapers, maybe I can learn more about how all that music was seen over time. And indeed, you see interesting things. If you look in these historical newspapers, there are these new releases, but then in 1815, where a bookstore says, hey, I found this new music. There happens to be this guy called Beethoven who wrote a set of variations, next to a guy called Dussek who also wrote a sonata. There are concert programs historically that were advertisements where people also said what they would play. And it teaches us a lot about what got programmed or not again. And I recall when I was back in school and I had Dutch, I was reading these novels, among others Eline Vere, who is in The Hague, who falls in love with an opera singer. And I recall that it really struck me that in the text, Couperus, the author, had a lot of detail about that opera performance. So I wanted to look it up, and I figured out that back then Muziekweb didn't actually have a CD of that piece at all. It turned out that back in the days, that was a mega hit, up to the point that there were ads that asked for ladies to become figurants on the stage for this particular opera. And if you would go a bit more the digital humanities route, where you would count how often something is mentioned, Le Tribut de Zamora, that particular opera, in the time that Eline Vere was taking place, was a very big hit. It was mentioned a lot in many newspapers, much more than more mainstream operas would be later on. So that's, I think, also a quite interesting thing to reflect on. And even more interesting, if you think of who gets to be canonic or big or revered. In classical music, probably Johann Sebastian Bach is now the godfather of classical music. But if you see how he is actually being mentioned in newspapers, he only really became notable there from a frequency-based perspective deep in the 20th century, like 200 years after he died. While he was living himself, he was not so notable. Handel was much bigger. He was in the court. Bach was a local church musician. Other people liked him and tried to push him. The Romantics, Liszt, Mendelssohn, they started really advocating for him. But only much, much later, actually, he entered the concert stages and people started liking and appreciating him. And that also is, for me, a bit of a reality check, because thinking back, if we would have a popularity-based recommender system back in 1680, probably Bach would have been cancelled. And that would be a bit confronting, I think. So I think that does argue for, indeed, not necessarily maybe going with one truth, if I want to frame it in the way that we've had discussions before, and to really think of how to keep that what we don't know within reach. And there, I think, another reason why I don't like that people typically then talk about algorithms, and why I rather talk about systems, is that we really also have to think of the experience that we offer. We see lots of these big services that come with very convenient experiences for us as users. If I search for a town, Seville, maybe I want information, maybe I want to be a tourist, maybe I want news, maybe I need a municipality. They smash all of that on the first page. And hopefully then I don't have to click too much to get further, because they optimize for those clicks. Even worse, if you think of a Google Home, it will only give me one answer. It will give me the I'm feeling lucky answer. There will not be any encouragement for me to try to look further. But as I said, we have to think about what these engagements indicate, and also what is not being looked at and what is not being followed. I definitely think that filtering algorithms can be beneficial there, because we as humans only know as much as we know. Only another party can tell us what we don't know, otherwise we would have seen it already. They can also help in promoting transparency or accountability, because you can be reasonably explicit about what you prioritize. You can show it, it's there, you have certain rules. You might, however, also disagree with the rules, and that's what I typically don't see so much yet in the algorithms versus classical approach. There are some ethical dilemmas also to think of here. And just to put it in a bit of a blunt and controversial way, a recommender system is a manipulation machine. You are going to surface something that the user did actually not ask for. And that is where we also see sometimes some reluctance, like should the user not indicate that? Are we in the place to actually steer this? It boils a bit down to that. At the same time, as said, these users themselves might not necessarily go through all the space and find everything. Recommending outside of a user's taste profile is very risky, also from a company's perspective. You might give them things that they don't like, that explicitly are further away from what they like. So you need to create trust there. But here we also have to think about metrics. If you do algorithms, if you are filtering things, you have to stick numbers on it. You have to find a ranking, and you have to optimize for something. And there we often now see that in the bigger platforms, there is a lot of focus on the shorter term engagement. Do many people click at this moment? And of course, then the more sensational content might be a bit easier to come through than the violent sonata of Matthijs Vermeulen. But is it all there is? And there I also like sometimes thinking of how we, for example, see that in a very different field. If you think of food, this is maybe also a bit of a fast food versus acquired taste type of discussion. Blue cheese, typically people don't like it at the first try. If that were an online item, you would throw it away and never go back. But if you try again and maybe try again, maybe you start liking it, and maybe you start liking it much more than what you used to have. So I think it's very important, as said, to not just speak about the algorithms, but also the broader experience and opportunity around it. I like this hidden treasure metaphor. There is something out there, but it's buried. We have to find it. We have to do a bit more effort to get there. Then, of course, there's the discussion on whether it's accepted to even point people at that. But if I think of teaching, which is another thing I do, no one questions that I don't only say what the students know and that I get them to see more. So there are some trusted situations where you can do this. And just to finish, I would also like to share, in terms of a physical experience, my favorite bookstore in London. It's the Archive bookstore. It's having lots of these old manuscripts in this cellar that is completely unorganized. If I go there, I just know I need to spend a few hours just going through everything, because everything is just everywhere. But there are so many cool things to find out there. And that's also an experience that we really don't see anymore so much these days. As we moved a lot in terms of commercials, so to the web shops, you typically directly go into what you need. There is not so much like go around, do a bit of effort, try a few things, and stumble upon something. So really, I would like to argue here that making that experience a bit more challenging or even difficult, it might not necessarily be a dirty thing. Of course, again, you need to have the opportunity and the situation. And for me, that's why I now look at more of these problems more in the public sphere, with libraries, with archives, because they have this mission to make more of that available. I don't have to really argue about competitors who make more profit if you don't do this. But I think it is a consideration to take into account also if you would be a commercial platform. So that's basically my story. Thanks for your attention, and happy to take any questions, which would be down here. How would you change recommender systems in order to prevent filter bubbles? Yeah, thank you for that question. This is a rather broad question, so I think really also touching a bit upon what Damian was saying about the filter bubbles. I think indeed that in principle we are exposed to more, and we are also reasonably open, a bit eclectic these days. We do accept seeing more things in our streams. The question is just whether we really engage with all of them in the same way. I think if you want to have recommender systems that don't push people to only look at the things they like and not more than that, first of all, you have to really think what kind of system you're building, what the proper criteria are there, what your audience is, what your metrics are. Start from there, maybe some more bigger values around it that you really want to embody. Make sure you actually evaluate and optimize for that. And in terms of the bubbles, as said, be careful that your user will typically be probably very happy to be bubbled. So if you don't want it, find a way where that is actually accepted. What could we do ourselves to come in contact with unknown content? Yes. So I made this video a while ago for the University of the Netherlands, where I try to encourage people to indeed do a bit more effort than just straight on going for the first hit. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to start exploring, where maybe indeed you just not only look at the first results of Google, but more than that. You maybe try a few more other things, you click on other items. Services like a Spotify or even a YouTube do offer that. There are these different shelves, playlists, other things. Talk to other human beings, I would also very much recommend, because I think lots of my unknown finds really came out of people that I trusted and that then said something and I was like, nah, I'm not going to do that, and then I did it after all, and then I liked it. So go into that discussion and accept that not everyone likes the same things, but it's fine. Do you see big data companies as responsible for filter bubbles? We might now already go a little bit into the panel discussion. So it's complicated, as said. Partially, yes, because typically it is very convenient, also from a servicing perspective. If someone becomes super predictable and only asks for the same thing all the time, and they are happy with that, and as a consequence they keep engaging with my platform might be considered to be extremely successful while I have to do little effort as the provider. So this is a difficult question, because for their existence I can understand that platforms sometimes need to think that way. And similarly, I want to quote an interesting problem we saw recently with news about Facebook, that there were these issues about Facebook actually maybe promoting some content they should not promote because fake news, and at the same time concerns that they were not treating people fairly in terms of what they showed to them. And then in the bipartisan situation, actually it turned out the Trump supporter kind of people, they felt that they were not treated equally because they saw less content that they liked. And then from a fairness principle, actually, there was more misinformation pushed as a consequence, because then the consumers were equally happy. So some of these responsible themes that we try to look at, fairness in this case, is a real problem. But that then gets ultimately operationalized in this way, which again is a bit awkward because it caused more misinfo to go into the streams again, and people were, again, really happy. So yeah, they are partially responsible. I do agree that from them alone, it's quite unlikely that they will be able to solve it, even if they might be well-intended. I'm not necessarily giving a judgment out here. At the same time, regulation only also would not make the cut either, because that's maybe too far away from that practice. So I do agree there with also Damian that we need people in between that can speak algorithms, but also speak domains and think of these difficult trade-offs that we have to make. I think those are all the questions. Yes, so thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Cynthia. And next we have a short break, 5 minutes, and then we move on to the panel discussion. So please stay tuned. Okay, welcome back everybody for this final portion of the event. So what we'll do now is have a bit of a panel discussion. Jelle is also, yes, wonderful, with us here. So what is going to happen is that, well, hopefully lively discussion, but the organizers have given me the task to pose some statements to you, and then we'll see if we get a discussion going. And I thought to kind of tag a little bit to what you were just talking about, Cynthia, one of the statements here is as follows about the responsibilities of different parties. So the statement is, individual users are responsible for being in a filter bubble and escaping from it instead of algorithms or social media companies. So that's the statement, and I was asked to give the floor first to Jelle due to connection issues. So Jelle, would you have a view on that? I hope you can hear us. Are we connected? Apparently, well, in the meantime, Jelle?
Yes, and I feel a little bit like Big Brother at this moment. I think it's a shared responsibility. I do agree with the other speakers that we should also think in terms of agency, and that there is also individual responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a yes?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes. Yes. It's just because of a slight delay that it was a little bit unclear who is going to go when, but yeah, thank you. So maybe we go around and have Cynthia and Damien, your responses.
Maybe you first, because I was just speaking.
Yeah. Yes, so indeed, it's a shared responsibility, and I know that that's always kind of a lame answer, of course, because one would want to have the one or the other.
Yeah,
But
well, there is something like a time lag in the communication.
I guess so.
It seems a rather major lag, actually. In terms of
Apparently,
Well,
yeah.
we're probably not able to solve it right now, so
No,
I'm
no.
just going to give an answer.
Yes, please.
So sorry,
Go
Jelle.
ahead.
What I find problematic of just saying it's the user is that it's kind of is like a blanket excuse to do everything. So it is this kind of very libertarian, it almost gets a political issue then, right? That you're saying, okay, just everyone is doing whatever they want. I don't think that's the solution. But I do think that it is too easy to just blame companies for designing an evil algorithm, because we also need to make a distinction between, let's say, unintended consequences that can happen by any kind of system. The more complex the system becomes, the less easy it is to have this straightforward, well, this is good, this is bad distinction. And I think that in the end, indeed, it is therefore, well, shared responsibility to some extent, even though that's maybe a kind of dissatisfying answer.
Well, yeah, I would agree with that too, as you heard from my previous response a bit. What I do want to add is that indeed there is a risk, though, that shared responsibility becomes an excuse to have no responsibility. We're very good at that in governance structures, I think, but also in this type of question, that saying it's the user, I do think the user has more responsibility than they currently take and are aware of. At the same time, if you just leave them as they are, as I said, maybe they're really happy with the status quo today. They're feeling listened to much more. So it goes against their experience, probably, if you want to go out of that and get confronted with people who are not like you. Then for the companies, even within the companies, of course, there also are big debates there. And I see that a lot as a computer scientist and a lecturer, that people come to me and say either like, it's the engineers who are responsible and it's your fault if you don't train them. Or it's like, yeah, but we are not trained. We are computer scientists, so we don't know the implications of the ethics theory. And that's where you get this interdisciplinary question, that I think ultimately you need people who understand at least the basics of the algorithms. They don't have to know all the details. And they need to engage with the people who know more of the legal and ethical frameworks, because what you often see is that purely legal ethical also comes with concepts that are maybe hard to operationalize or really optimize for in a very crisp way. Think of fairness. We shall treat everyone equally. What does that mean? There are like 40 interpretations at least of that mathematically. So which one to choose? It's also not just the algorithmic person to decide that. And that needs, again, the domain knowledge even, which is not even the legal or algorithmic expert. So there is responsibility that is shared, I would argue. But we have to be quite explicit about who that actually is, and it's really everyone.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Would you have, now I'm asking quite a lot maybe, but would you have ideas on then how exactly that would happen? How
Yeah,
th-
so
yes,
ideas, I think it's in the line with what basically both Jelle and Damian have been mentioning. So first of all, the training. We do have a responsibility as lecturers, and Damian actually teaches NLP to his communication students. I try to teach responsible ethics also to my computer science people, to have them thinking a bit about, you have your own discipline, which is fine, but there are these connections and implications of what you do, and you might indeed not be the only one who can judge that. At the same time, I think we should also be very careful in these selling outcomes, and that's something that I liked Jelle bringing up, like in terms of what science also is or isn't, like claiming that also, for example, the algorithms are superior over the user experience. You see even a bit of that type of struggle within computer science, because the data is big and objective, and well, come on. So those types of things, I think that we need to be much more humble and constructive, if I may say it that way.
Anything to add, Jelle or Damien?
I don't. I
Others?
just
Okay.
fully agree. So.
Thanks for that. Otherwise, because I have two other statements here from the organizers, and I take it too much to a sidetrack so that I cover my assignment. A related question maybe, what do you think of the statement that we can break online filter bubbles by making users pay for their social media accounts? Again, maybe we could try to go to Jelle first. There is a bit of a lag, apparently, but
It's quite some lag.
yes,
it's a lot of like, yeah.
Would you like to take, yeah.
Or we start talking and
Yes.
so that when,
Yes.
yeah.
And then Jelle just must interrupt us.
Yeah.
Fine. Well, I have some idea on that, and that is maybe, again, taking that a bit away from how the question is formulated in the first place, because I do think that the underlying reasoning here is that probably if you take away the incentive of, let's say, the whole advertisement business and all of that, that maybe then you could basically move towards more the long-term goals that also Cynthia was talking about. On the other hand, I do not believe that just by paying you actually achieve that goal, because you still, if you think of it as a commercial company, for instance, in that context, then you still have a goal. You still want to have someone to subscribe it, and maybe it is not then necessarily just the next click. It becomes maybe, well, let's say whether you continue your subscription or whatever, but I don't think that just paying fundamentally changes the incentive structure. There is some change, but not completely. So I do see why, for instance, privacy advocates who are very skeptical about, let's say, ad tracking and all of these kind of things, why they say, well, we should just have everything paid services and then we disincentivize that. But regarding the diversity of exposure, I'm not sure that this is basically the way to go.
Yeah, and well, Jelle is not yet reacting. I will just go on then.
Go, yeah, please.
Yeah, the issue here is, if there again the individual citizen would have to pay, I have a bit of the concern that that's an obstacle that they will also go around with. And in music, for example, we saw that people then just go underground. So I like this concept that's been coined in the past of maybe even these types of considerations as nutsbedrijven, as it's called in Dutch. So more like electrical or water supplies, that maybe there is a bit of a public body out there that might just get a subscription for making sure that this works. How it would work, I wouldn't be able to tell. That's not my specialty, but I think a construction similar to that would be more logical than an individual subscription system on an individual citizen.
Right, interesting. I think we may have lost Jelle, or... Okay, we just go forward, yes? Yeah, it's too bad. Okay, well, statement 3, and then we see where we get. So this get more into the area of conspiracy theories. And the question here is whether spreading conspiracy theories should be dealt with more harshly and not be covered by freedom of speech.
Well, I guess Jelle would be the person to address that out of all of us. But in the absence of that, I don't think that the concept of freedom of speech, as if we're talking about social media platforms, is necessarily the most useful one, because and talk about freedom of speech, then we essentially typically, and of course that also differs a lot between countries and also cultural norms and so on, but in general we are talking about things like that the government should not restrict your speech and these kind of things. And I think it's a misunderstanding if you would say that freedom of speech entails a right to be heard or something like that, right? So the fact that you have the freedom to say whatever political opinion you want does not mean that I need to invite you to my house and tell my family about that. And I think that we can extend that logic to some extent to online platforms where you could also say, well, it is essentially someone's right to have house rules and not facilitate the utterance of each and every possible thing, even though this is legally allowed to utter. I think the problem then, of course, is that we have the monopolies, or almost monopolies, where we have very few of these platforms, so that we essentially have a situation where maybe one private company ultimately decides on the rules of public discourse, and that is something that is unwanted. But I think that is essentially a slightly different problem than the issue of freedom of speech, and therefore I think that, well, we should be critical about the fact that there are kind of monopolies in that area, but the fact that someone who offers a platform can also set house rules is not something that is in conflict with the freedom of speech, I think.
Right, that's not the,
Something seems to happen with the Zoom. No? Okay, then I will also add my take until, but if you had to go speak, I will mute myself.
Yeah.
What I find difficult here is indeed that I like this idea of house rules that Damian mentioned just now. I think it's really more about code of conduct style of behavior more than what you can or can't say. Of course, we are all free to say things, but we now use it as an excuse to say whatever we want and be excused. And I think a lot of these types of talks, indeed, in your own house, with your own family, to your own mother, would not quite have the same type of tone as what we sometimes see on the internet. So, and you see it a lot, even if you go into normal society and discourse, it's really not the same tone at all. So I do think there are some different realities here where in the real world I'm also unrestricted to speak, and people do behave differently out there. So probably morally they might even also have some hint themselves on what they can or can't do, similarly to what Damian was saying about whether people are echoes or filter bubbles or not. They might have quite some awareness of what's out there, and in the physical world they actually are just among us and not underground necessarily. So I think it's much more that than indeed restricting or putting things in a very formal way. Because of course the danger is you go into censorship as a consequence.
yes, indeed. I'm now looking at if we can still catch Jelle or we just proceed.
Yes, if...
Oh, perfect.
Great.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Finally,
please.
the expert.
Yes, but I hear myself now from 3 different directions.
Oh no.
With 4 egos. So maybe this is simply not working, and I think it's better if you continue the discussion, because the discussion as such is too interesting to let it disturb by this technological stuff.
Okay, that's really too bad, but well, it's technology. What can you do? Then maybe we can still return to that final question about the freedom of expression, and I think what you were saying also goes back to the responsibility question. Okay, now Jelle is gone. Responsibility question. Like, what is the role of the platforms? Should we blame algorithms, and if so, to what extent? And take a broader picture, like you were saying, Cynthia. Well, we first might have to establish whether there is a problem. Like, what is the problem? Is it misinformation, people being misinformed, or spreading misinformation, or getting too much of the same thing, or too little of something that they would need? The variety of problems also seem to be quite huge, right? And I mean, people don't even agree what is the problem. So where do you start assigning responsibility? Now I'm asking a very kind of complicated question, but what is the problem in the first place, if any, in your view, in connection to filter bubbles? And then what will be the solution?
Well, to me, I do think the problem is that we now let things too loose and put them too easily into a particular box that's not us. So first of all, what I was speaking about, that I'm a little ticked off by it's the algorithm or it's the human, that type of speaking. Because algorithms are made by humans and followed by certain decisions that are made, and even there, again, if the engineer is to blame, they have a responsibility, but they're also told what to build. And the data shows certain things, and if you follow it or not, that's a choice that you make, which is normative. At the same time, I think, again, maybe the thinking of other general public health and public supply stories might be a nice metaphor again to keep, which we don't do yet, because now it's really out with the platforms, not yet in the public sphere, but like water and electricity, these types of platforms, the way we get information online, I think they are quite core now to our daily business very much, and us as citizens, how we live. And next to that, similarly, again, thinking maybe more of the food sphere, I also think there that you have the option to eat fast food or buy caviar or eat healthy or not, and no one tells you what to do, but you kind of know what choices you make and what the consequences are. And maybe a bit more going into that type of direction could be a way to go, because now there's nothing at all on that. And information literacy, even there, I'm not quite sure how that's currently being taught. I think people get told that they have to be critical, but yeah, conspiracy theorists are critical too. So I think it's much more indeed a kind of that we need some civil code between us. And I don't quite know how to make it, but I think it's somewhere there. And that then also it becomes a bit more of this shared responsibility we won't challenge.
I think, I mean, I'm also not an expert on literacy programs and things like that, but I do think, like, from what I see around me and from things that I know that colleagues are sometimes talking about, and also actually from, let's say, well, discussions with schools, for instance. So we actually gave a lot of guest lectures before the Dutch elections on high schools, and there basically I have the feeling that the idea of teaching to be critical boils indeed down to, yeah, don't trust something just because it was on Facebook, these kind of things. Yeah. But that kind of simplifies the problem way too much. And indeed, I sometimes also think that by just saying, like, well, okay, you need to be critical of the media, that can actually go way too far very easily. Yeah, then you come into the conspiracy theory thing. So I think we sometimes moved a bit too far, that we said, like, well, okay, you need to be critical of the media, and suddenly we say, yeah, okay, I am. I don't believe what NOS now says. But that was, of course, never intended. So I do agree that we lack the proper solutions there. And I also don't have it. But coming back also to what you asked about what the problem actually is, then I would say that the problem is that public discourse moves online for a large part. It's hard to deny, and there are a lot of good things on there, but that we basically just let it happen without actually thinking of it. Your idea about the nutsvoorzieningen could be one approach of doing it, but we actually did not design something, right? So there was basically this very naive approach of the very beginnings of the internet. If you now read some writings from the 1990s with these kind of utopia, and everyone can now finally discuss without borders, and it's basically like a Habermas coffee house finally made true, these kind of things. That was very naive. And then it's basically almost an anarchistic vision, which of course did not play out that way. And then it basically became a hyper-commercialized environment. And because we cannot solve these things on a national level, but we don't really have any kind of ideas on how to do that on an international level, therefore I think we basically have this situation that the reality that a lot of discourse is happening online, and it is actually more efficient to share information with an online system rather than printing something on paper and delivering it with a truck to households. And actually I do like reading a paper newspaper, but it is not efficient. So there are reasons why these things happen online, but we just let it happen, and we didn't have a design behind it. And I'm not sure how to solve it.
And just maybe another brainwave I just had, like, are we maybe considering the problem as too big of a problem, and does it become too abstract as a consequence? Because these types of questions also have a lot of similarity to the discussions we currently see around diversity and inclusion. And I've been doing also some projects on that with libraries, and what you really see there is that they also look at their collections, they're like, oh, we know not all the perspectives are in there, we know not everything is in there, what should we do? And then immediately we go into these huge social problems of inequality. And when I was also speaking to them, because we want with the library world to also make recommenders that maybe help them to make their collections more inclusive or better or get more people to discover more, immediately you get these people who are there like, so we have to do something with Black Lives Matter. And well, it's one of the big problems that are there, or something with Zwarte Piet, but we don't have that issue out here. And then you get that type of discussion. And it's definitely the discussion we now see a lot in the news and that people have a lot of emotion about. But it's also maybe even topical diversity. Like, do you only read that particular theme or that particular genre, or only books that are about this particular story? And that's the same. And but people don't see that it's actually all part of the same kind of framing. Because the hard thing here is that indeed regulating and putting things, it also means putting things further away from the daily floor, I'd say. And there, I guess that you have to address it at all the levels, and that indeed locally we have to just keep telling other people about the realities of these information spaces, and that these rankings might not be the same, that you get maybe another suggestion than me. Where at the same time, indeed, from a more formal regulating perspective, more work needs to be done, which is being done. But again, in the reality of also the lobbies that take place there and the different considerations that are there.
Okay, I'm very sorry. Unfortunately, we're now running out of time, so we have to conclude. But I guess this is a good place to end, more or less. Shared responsibility. I mean, homework for everybody. How do we solve this? We covered some dimensions that might be helpful here. And so I'm going to leave it to the organizers themselves to close officially. But thank you very much, both of you, for this. And too bad we lost Jelle, but thank you ever so much. And the floor is to you.
All right. So those were our 4 speakers of today. So in the end, kind of a tradition, you need to thank everyone. So now I will. First of all, obviously, I'd like to thank our speakers. 2 of them are still on the stage. Jelle as well, I know you're still watching. Thank you for attending our symposium, for giving us inspiring and educative talks. Second of all, I'd like to thank Tilburg University, Studium Generale, and MindLabs for making this symposium possible. Thirdly, maybe especially, I'd like to thank the Symposium Committee for organizing this special event. It's been quite a ride. We've been having since September. We did an outstanding job. I think we've never done anything like this before. So I believe that deserves a big round of digital applause. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank you at home for watching this year's symposium. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something of it. And especially I hope our VIPs, Giel and Nigel, had a lovely afternoon as well. So on behalf of the Symposium Committee, I'd like to thank you for watching and see you next year.